What has to happen for your money to be worth so little that it's more valuable made into ardent bags than spent in a shop? This is 2018 in Venezuela. The country was in such a bad economic situation that the national money, the bolivar, was worth close to nothing. And that was due to inflation, or to be more precise, in the case of Venezuela, hyperinflation. And the crisis didn't stop at bags made out of cash. It also emptied shelves, brought the population to the streets, and pushed millions to flee the country. In 2022, it's Europe and the rest of the world's turn to worry about inflation. And it already has a major impact on our lives.
Economic activity is slowing.
We are asking the member states to reduce by 15% the gas consumption.
To understand how inflation happens and how it can get as bad as it was in Venezuela, we need to look at what inflation actually is, what causes it, and the role central banks play in managing it. So let's start with a simple definition.
L'inflation, c'est
la hausse du niveau général des prix.
Okay, but why do prices go up? To try and understand that, we need to take a look at the link between supply and demand in an economy.
Les entreprises produisent des biens et ils essaient de les vendre aux ménages ou aux entreprises ou à l'État. Donc, ce que produisent les entreprises, les économistes appellent ça l'offre, le côté offre de l'économie. Du côté demande, c'est les gens qui veulent acheter ces biens, donc les ménages, les entreprises ou l'État. Donc quand il y a plus de biens et services à vendre que de personnes qui veulent les acheter, les prix ont tendance à diminuer.
S'il y a une demande excessive qui conduit donc à un déséquilibre entre la demande et l'offre, les prix se mettront à monter pour équilibrer offre et demande.
Alright, so we have inflation when prices go up. Or to phrase it differently, when the money in your pocket doesn't let you buy as much anymore. And that is actually how inflation is calculated. Organizations like Eurostat for the EU or the Bureau of Labour Statistics for the US constantly monitor hundreds of prices of key goods and services you typically buy. They build a typical basket that kind of represents what is consumed in a typical household. And therefore, the French basket doesn't look like, say, the American one. Each item in a basket has a different weight depending on its importance. Then they track the basket over time and turn its evolving price into a single figure, an index.
Quand cet indice augmente, c'est ce qu'on appelle l'inflation. Quand cet indice diminue, c'est ce qu'on appelle la déflation.
So we know how inflation is measured, and we know inflation comes from an imbalance between supply and demand. But what can cause those changes? Most economists agree that we can group the causes into three main categories. The first, which we touched on earlier, is related to growing demand. That one is called demand pull inflation. A recent example would be what happened after the COVID lockdowns. We were stuck at home for a while, not spending much, and when we got out, we wanted to buy stuff. The problem was that the global supply chain was messed up and couldn't give us what we were looking for. And as we said earlier, higher demand plus limited supply equals higher prices. In other words, inflation. The second category is the cost push inflation, and it's the flip side of the demand pull inflation. This time it's the cost of actually making a product or service that increases. And that can be linked to a higher labour cost or an increased cost of raw materials due to shortages. Let's take a bike as an example. We know that if it costs more money for a company to build a bike because the price of rubber for tyres goes up, we'll end up paying more for that bike. And yes, Russian gas falls into this category too. Here, higher costs for companies means higher prices for consumers, and we get inflation. The last category is the built-in inflation. And the best example for it is the wage price spiral. And it goes like this.
Si l'inflation augmente parce que les prix des matières premières augmentent, les revendications sur le pouvoir d'achat vont être fortes, les gens vont demander à juste titre des augmentations de salaire puisqu'en fait leur pouvoir d'achat diminue.
Si les salaires venaient à être indexés sur cette augmentation des prix pour protéger les ménages qui en payent le prix en quelque sorte.
Donc ça fait un effet de deuxième tour sur l'inflation qui fait augmenter le prix de tous les autres biens.
And we enter the spiral. A bit of inflation, so we raise salaries to catch up. Now people have more money, so companies raise the prices of their goods. And we have more inflation. and so on. So clearly inflation has to be controlled. And the best way to do that is through central banks, like the ECB for the European Union or the Fed for the US. To put it simply, central banks are the banks for banks. Their job is to manage the currency of a country or a group of countries and the amount of money in circulation. They have one main objective.
The most precious good that we can deliver and that we have to deliver is price stability.
Your bank, the one you go to when you need a business loan or a mortgage, can turn to the central bank to borrow money. And that's where the central bank's power over inflation really comes from.
L'instrument habituel de politique monétaire pour la Banque centrale, comme la Banque centrale européenne, c'est la maîtrise des taux directeurs.
Okay, what that means is when the central bank changes its rate, they are essentially making it more expensive for your bank to borrow money. And your bank will have to reflect that onto you in your mortgage or loan rates, for example. The overall goal is to try to slow down your spending, slowing the demand for goods in the hope that this will reduce inflation. But this way of fighting inflation doesn't come without a risk.
Si on fait une politique restrictive, à ce moment-là, on crée une récession. Ça peut être bon pour la Banque centrale parce qu'elle va mieux réaliser sa cible d'inflation, mais c'est mauvais pour l'économie puisque ça augmente le chômage et ça réduit l'activité économique et ça crée une récession.
We expect inflation to remain undesirably high for some time.
The world may soon be teetering on the edge of a global recession, only 2 years after the last one.
So, are we about to enter the situation Venezuela was in 4 years ago? Is there a way for Europe to avoid that happening?
Beaucoup de choses vont dépendre de la manière dont le conflit, par exemple, entre la Russie et l'Ukraine va se développer. Si c'est un conflit qui dure, alors à ce moment-là, il y aura peut-être des effets structurels qui vont se mettre en œuvre. Si c'est un conflit qui se résout assez rapidement et que les prix des matières premières rebaissent, peut-être qu'on aura un retour à la normale plus rapide.